guess, I think,
I have.
oh, yeah.
You're live, Madam Chair.
Okay, thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the special Electoral Area Services Committee meeting for October 19th, 2021. I'd like to first acknowledge that we are having this meeting on the traditional territory of the Coast Salish peoples. And with that, I'd like an approval of the agenda. Moved, second, all in favor? Opposed, if any? Motion's carried. Is there any public input, Ms. Harrison?
Thank you, Madam Chair. There is none.
Okay, we move on to reports. R1, Ms. Harrison.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Item R1 is a report from the Community Planning Division regarding Bylaw number 4373, Official Community Plan for the Electoral Areas.
Okay, I'd like to introduce Ms. Breen. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
You're muted.
It's just working, I'm sorry.
Okay, there you go. Welcome.
Am I, okay? Okay, thank you.
You're kind of,
Good afternoon.
can't hear you clearly enough. Maybe,
Hello?
yes,
Is that
that's
better?
better. Thank you. That's good. Go ahead. Oh, now it's muted. Muted.
IT, help me.
There, it's good. You're good. Oh, no.
Hello?
Cutting in. There, you're on.
Okay. I'll speak quickly.
Okay.
Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, directors. The purpose of this afternoon is to present the materials that were sent in the package to you. It's the beginning drafts of the modernized OCP that we have prepared for community consultation beginning after Christmas in the January to March period of time. We did not anticipate that the directors would have fulsomely digested this entire package over the weekend. So it was meant to advance this information into the public realm and for your consideration for review prior to those meetings. So this afternoon, we have invited, the CBRD has invited community planning, two of our consultants who have worked on this from Modus, which is Edward Porter and Patrick Ostrick. If you can just raise your hands, they will start off the presentation today and will be leading us through the agenda and the review of the documents. Mark Holland from Holland Planning, who will speak on the performance metrics, and Aaron Licker from Licker Geospatial, who has been our GIS expert that's been assisting Rob and Andrea with the analysis and the metrics for the new land use designations. We will be taking questions at the end of each segment, and a break, of course, is at the purview of the chair. So I'm now going to hand this over to Edward Porter, who will start the meeting off today. And I believe we have a question.
Who do we have a question? Oh, Director Morrison, go ahead, please.
Thank you, and thank you, Ms. Breen, for that explanation, because I was just about going to have to admit defeat for the very first time in my career and not being able to, as you said, digest all of the material in the brief time that we were able to review it. I want to just pose a question to staff. This, I find, was a very difficult document to try and read and peruse on a computer screen. Can we ask that there be paper hard copies produced so that we can go through them at our leisure and not be staring at a computer screen? And it takes forever to load the next page. It was very difficult. So I don't know who we need to pose that question to, but before we go much further into this, I would really like to have a paper copy of this.
Thank you, Director Morrison. That was asked by other directors to me, so that is something that I'm sure that staff can do. And I turn now to Director Salmon. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you. Before we get started, I just wanted to take a moment to thank Coralie and her team. I know at our last board at the very end, we passed the HOCP without any comment or fanfare whatsoever, but I know it was a lot of work, and so Coralie and Rob and Andrea and everyone else that helped, just like to,
Thank you so much. Oh, we get the virtual, you're getting the virtual clap on that one. And with that virtual clap, we turn to Mr. Porter, I believe. Go ahead, please. I think you're on mute.
I think you're
You are
muted.
on mute.
There we go. I was
There we
double
go.
muted
Okay.
live. Thank you. And thanks everyone for being here today. And again, thanks and the recognition for Coralie and the team and everything that's gone ahead of us today. So this is a fairly momentous occasion, to borrow one of Mark's favorite words. And we're excited to take a moment and present. And as Coralie mentioned, we'll also break up the agenda today with opportunities for questions and discussion, sort of in hopefully bite-sized pieces. So without further ado, I think we'll jump right in. I'm Edward Porter, Principal Senior Urban Designer and Planner with Modus Planning Design Engagement. And I'll be just giving a quick introduction to the agenda today, and I'll pass it off pretty quickly here to Patrick, who's been leading our effort and our team. So just to give you a quick overview as to the discussion today, we're going to speak briefly, remind ourselves of the purpose of the meeting today. But the balance here is we'll be covering off the vision and the goals of the modernized OCP. We'll review those again together. We will move then into, and I should say, the vision and the goals that set direction for the rest of the content here that we'll review today. And all of this review really with the intent of giving you all a really thorough orientation to the document, and the hopes is that will then further support the review that you'll have ahead of you. So we'll go through the vision and goals again to set that direction. We'll look at a bit of a recap of the logic and the framework by which we approached the updates to land use designations, and how we found the ability to consolidate some of those across the modernization effort. We'll then look at how that maps onto the land. We'll then move into the review of policies and those policies as they support the individual goals. Building on those policies, then we'll share the stage here, and Mark will lead us through a discussion around performance metrics and how we will then tie the policies to the ability to measure those through a set of indicators, performance metrics. And finally, the last section, we will come back to the map and look at how the growth containment boundaries are identified in a series of maps as well. So that sets the agenda for our time together. It's ambitious, but we've got some good time here today. The intent is that this is more of a workshop format. So if there are things that aren't making sense, or if you want to jump in and offer some conversation, please do so. And with that, I will pass it over to Patrick. Oh, sorry. You know what, Patrick? Why don't you take it? Because I think this is into the meat of the presentation.
Sure. Thank you so much, Edward. First, I'd like to just say how much of an honor it's been to work with your staff over the course of the last few years. It's an extremely dedicated and supportive team at the CVRD, from Coralie and her planners, that planning department, as well as the excellent GIS staff and the many others who've contributed to this project. It's been an absolute pleasure, and it's been a collaborative process right from the get-go, and I've been thrilled to be a part of this process and this excellent work. So I just wanted to extend my gratitude there for the whole team. So today, the purpose really is to provide an overview to the directors on the draft modernized official community plan, with the intent and the knowledge that this is still a work in progress. As we know, this is a first kick at the can. And of course, as we move through the next stage of this work, there's certainly time and ability to make edits and change it to make sure that it reflects community values. And that's specifically intended to happen through feedback that we receive here, but also feedback that would be received through the community circles, which are intended to happen in the early stages of 2022. And so that is the purpose of today, and we're really excited to be here. One of the things that we have said from the get-go is this mantra of both communicating a very compelling story about why we need to modernize the electoral area official community plans, but also thinking about the beauty of simplicity and trying to simplify some of the land use policy and direction within these plans as well. And so what we found is in communicating a compelling story, we can be clear, we can be concise, and we can be consistent with our messaging. And that goes not just with the messaging, but also in the policies and the land use designations and what our official community plan essentially communicates out to the community. And then in terms of the beauty of simplicity, what we really want to make sure is that we're holding the line on that simplicity and we're continuously questioning whether a policy item or regulation is best suited for either the official community plan, the zoning bylaw, development permit guidelines, or another land use tool that might be appropriate for those. And so we've gone through this exercise of ensuring that the right policy is using the right tool and so on. And I think that is really to the benefit of this modernized official community plan.
The last thing that I'll just make a note on that, Patrick, and this goes to acknowledge the effort of the CVRD team ahead of our involvement, was just how much of that was clear when we got started. Because in essence, we started with the complexity. We began with considering DPA guidelines across multiple plans and the sort of detail and complexity based on the diversity of these local communities. And so we began in those details, and we'll see that later in the presentation as we even start to look at land use designations and trying to simplify this. But all to say, that was a guiding principle throughout, but it wasn't to say that any stone was left unturned. There's a ton of work that happened through this by looking at all those individual details and finding ways to simplify. So thanks.
And so to start off, we'll go right into the vision and goals here. The vision and goals are very much the product of community engagement that happened earlier on in the process, and what we believe to be a strong reflection of community values and aspirations throughout the electoral areas. So what we have for the vision is an overarching sort of vision statement, and then 3 sort of smaller paragraphs to complement that overarching vision. So I'll just read it out for everyone. But surrounded by thriving natural environments and farmlands, the Cowichan Valley is a collective of vibrant and distinct communities. Our connection to nature is at the heart of our identity. Our communities, complete with shops, services, parks, and playgrounds, are steps away from pristine forests, trails, and water bodies. Sustainable local jobs, prosperous industries, diverse housing options, and a flourishing public life inspire people of all ages and incomes to enjoy our rural way of life. Growth is intentional and managed. So our water and land resources are protected, our infrastructure is maintained responsibly, our productive agricultural landscapes are supported and celebrated, our communities are complete, connected, and coexist with nature. And finally, resilience to emerging trends will define our community's future. So our ability to adapt and respond will be strengthened by our relationships with our residents, local First Nations, member municipalities, neighboring regional districts, and senior levels of government. Transparency, trust, and openness in these relationships will allow our region to make responsible decisions, be accountable, and embrace the future and thrive. And so paired with that vision statement are goals. And these goals, again, also are the product of that community engagement process, form a chapter. Each one has its own chapter with related policies in the modernized official community plan for the electoral areas. And so we have 8 in total. The first being to manage infrastructure responsibly, so everything that has to do with servicing and infrastructure, waste management. Then we have make distinct and complete communities, so everything related to housing and healthy communities, complete communities. We have an expand mobility options, which is in relation to transportation and the ability to walk or roll or take transit within our communities. Protecting and enhancing natural assets is a very important goal as well, and informs that important policy chapter related to natural asset management. Strengthening local food and agricultural systems. Obviously, there's a very large base of agriculture in the region, and ensuring that local food is secure and people have access to local food is also very important in relation to that very large agricultural land reserve. There's also enhancing regional prosperity, and so thinking about the local economy and how we can ensure that future jobs have a place in the Cowichan Valley. Mitigating and adapting to the climate crisis. So one of the most challenging issues we're facing, throughout the world, really. And so really looking at what types of actions that we can take at the regional scale to mitigate and adapt to this climate crisis. And finally, improving governance and implementation. And so this is the policy chapter that deals specifically with implementation and performance metrics. And so with that, this is the shortest part of the presentation, vision and goals, but we felt that maybe this is a good opportunity to maybe reflect on that and hear if there's any thoughts or questions about the vision and the goals of the MOCP.
Perfect. And if you could put your screen down for a moment so I could see my fellow directors, and then I'll see if there's any hands up. And are there any questions for Patrick or Edward? I'm seeing Director Wilson. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for that. I've just been scanning quickly through the whole document while you've been talking there, Patrick. Thank you for that. And I'm first of all, I'm completely in agreement with this. I would have loved to have seen this much earlier, and certainly in a printed copy. I've got a little bit of a question as far as the involvement of Modus as consultants is concerned here, which may be a little bit off topic, but I'm going to ask them anyway. You guys are involved with a lot of other municipalities and local governments, and I'm just wondering if there's any trickle down effect from some of the things that you've been talking to other municipalities about. And one of the things that brings this up is the recent meeting that North Cowichan had, where there's an awful lot of stuff that is probably not really inclusive of a plan. Do you see anything like that which is included in there, such as applicants for business licenses, living wages, community contract, 4-day week, all that kind of thing? Has any of that trickled down into what we're discussing there? I suspect it hasn't, but I'd like to put this out there so that everybody else is aware of what's going on in other areas. Do you have any comments on that particular thing?
Yeah, so I think one important, or through the board chair to Mr. Wilson, I think one of the things that Modus is very apt at is to listening to the very specific input from various communities. And so when we launch into a project, we make sure that we're responding to what we hear from staff, from public, residents, from external stakeholders as well. And we really try to fine tune each plan and project to that specific context. And so what I would say is that to the specific examples that you gave, I don't believe those elements or features are located within this particular MOCP. It's been a process where we've been very clear about jurisdictional matters and ensuring that What is located within an official community plan really speaks to the bread and butter of an official community plan, which means things specific to land use, and so we've been very intentional about making sure that that those policies are related to land use as much as possible and are within the jurisdiction of the regional district.
Good, thank you. Follow up, please, Madam Chair.
Go ahead.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Patrick. And this is one of my main concerns, that sticking within the jurisdictional guidelines or the jurisdictional lanes that we are supposed to be. I would hate to go outside of those, as some of the quotations that I've given there. We can't allow that to happen. We are mandated to do what we're supposed to do, and I'm glad to see that you're doing that. And there will be some other questions that I've got, but in the meantime, that's it. Thank you very much for your answers.
Thank you. Director Kuhn, I turn to you for questions for the first part of our presentation. Go ahead, please.
Yes. Reading that whole proposed plan, it seems to me that, and that is adding to Director Wilson's comment, there's an effort being made to squeeze social policy into an OCP. And I'm very much opposed to that, because it seems we always complain at the CVID about provincial governments downloading and we are taking on more and more responsibility. Well, here, it seems to me we're almost asking for it. We're willingly branching out into social policies within the OCP, and I don't think any of these social policies. I mean, there's gender mentioned in there, there's race mentioned, there's sexual orientation. That doesn't belong into an OCP, and I'm very much opposed to that. And I think there should be a whole big rewrite of that whole section there to take some of that stuff out, because an OCP, as you said yourself, deals with land use and planning, and that's where it should stop. Thank you.
So not any questions on the 8 goals or whatever, or the vision. So go ahead, Director Morrison.
Thank you, Madam Chair. One quick thing. It's just jumping off the page at me, and senior levels of government. We're really trying to get away from that and just refer to them as other orders of government. I don't know if that's the language that you're using, but there's an awful lot of effort across the province trying to go to that orders of government as opposed to senior levels of government. And I'd be unhappy if the current wording stayed in.
Thank you. I turn back to Director Wilson. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. And not to labour a point, but just building on what Director Kuhn said here, I also have concerns, as I've said just now, about some of the things which may be included. For instance, there's a term there called, I don't know even what it means, social equity. And there's other bits talking about housing and childcare, which are already being taken care of by others. Really, I don't see that this belongs in places like this. I don't. I just don't understand it. And I'd like to see those really looked at very carefully, or just taken out altogether.
Thank you. Okay, go ahead. Edward, you'd like to speak? Your hand is up on the screen.
Thank you very much. I think I just want to clarify the intent of the social planning considerations and considerations around equity within the plan. And that is only to suggest or to just acknowledge that, the traditional space of planning around land use and transportation and servicing, these all have implications to advantages or disadvantages that people in our community face. And so the intent of that portion of the plan is to acknowledge that, and then to effectively, in understanding how some people are better served or not as well served as others, have the ability to acknowledge that and to filter and to identify places where we may not intentionally be disadvantaging certain populations over others. And so that's the intent. It's simply to highlight certain policies and to keep some consideration for how we consider land use, transportation, servicing, parks policies, all of these things that are nuts and bolts within our typical land use planning toolkit, and just be aware of how they may have impact. So that's the intent of that tool within the plan. Thank you.
Follow up, Director Wilson. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Porter. I fully agree with you, but here's my problem. Intent always expands to something else. I don't like the use of the word intent. I would much rather see something more specific, because intent becomes direction all of a sudden, and it can be changed, and it will be changed. I have no problem with including people who are or disadvantaged or less advantaged than I am. But let's get something clear here. Intent always becomes something else. It will, I will guarantee it right now. And I like to see a lot more clarity as opposed to just the words suggestion or intent, because they're not definitive enough. That's my take on it anyway. It's not meant to be a criticism, although it sounds like it. It's meant to be how the way I feel. We cannot have this kind of thing going on here with the stuff that we shouldn't be involved in.
Director Martman, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Chair. And I didn't know if this is a point of order or not, but I feel like
Your
rather
sound is very garbled. Sorry, I don't know if you can change your microphone or move it around or something. It's cutting out.
now.
That's much better.
Okay, I think it might be my connection. Okay, I was just saying that I don't know if it's a point of order, but I feel like we're jumping over things, and I'd rather have a presentation on each topic rather than jump back and forth before that gets before we discuss it. I thought we should stick to the vision and goals and move on.
Thank you so much. I'd like to move on now, not seeing that was the first section, and thank you very much. It's a great way of doing this presentation. So if we can stick to our questions to each section, it's really helpful for us to be able to follow along. Thank you, Director Martman. Go ahead, then whoever is going to take on the next piece.
All right, that's going to be me again.
Okay.
Thank you for the comments, and yeah, we'll move into the piece on land use here. And so one of the things that we'd like to start off by doing is really reminding of the distinction between some of the land use tools that we have in our toolbox. Specifically land use designations as part of the official community plan, and the policy direction in an official community plan is something distinct from the zoning bylaw, which then regulates how things are built and operated. For example, the rules that govern not only permitted uses, but also heights and setbacks, sizes and locations of buildings. And then finally, the development permit guidelines, which offer that final layer of planning and direction related to really site-specific issues, whether it be form and character considerations or things like steep slopes and environmental protection. And so really what we're getting into today is that official community plan piece. We won't be presenting anything on the zoning bylaw or the development permit guidelines. So we want to make sure that we're really honing into that topic of land use designations, growth containment boundaries, and policies within the official community plan. So we've really explicitly tried to, as we move through this process, we've wanted to have that simplicity top of mind, and so we wanted to make sure that we could use a tool like the Transect, which you've all seen before, as sort of an organizing framework, and imagining the Cowichan Valley within these 7 sort of distinct types of settlement patterns, ranging from resource and natural areas where there's very little interaction with humans and with people, residents, to urban areas where there's significant human activity. And then finally, special districts for those places that don't quite fit neatly within this gradient or pattern that you see on your screen. The truth is that most of the Cowichan Valley really fits within that resource and natural, rural and agricultural, and for the most part, suburban in some places as well, where those human settlement patterns exist. There are examples of things like village areas and maybe a little bit of urban pattern, but very little in terms of urban and downtown type of settlement patterns within the regional district. We would argue that the urban and the downtown parts are located within the incorporated municipalities. And so when we're talking about the land use designations, we're really talking about things that span from the resource and natural all the way to maybe the village transect areas. And this organizing framework helped us really think about types of density thresholds that can ensure that our land use designations reflect what can be built within them. It's a question of certainty, it's a question of clarity, and so that means that rural areas stay rural. They are typically under 1 unit per hectare in density. They're typically not serviced by things like water pipes and sewer pipes. They typically don't have transit service coming, within frequent times within those areas either. But then when we move into sort of suburban areas, well, then we're looking at densities above 1 unit per hectare. And that's a really important threshold as we get into the growth containment boundaries a little later on in the presentation. But we've really tried to hold the line on that so that we have land use designations that are rural, that are under 1 unit per hectare, and then land use designations that turn into that sort of suburban densities above 1 unit per hectare and yet below 30 units per hectare. And this is where suburban type of densities start to change a little bit. They have a frontage to a street. They are typically serviced with water and sewer, maybe some transit as well. I see somebody's raising a hand. Do we want to address this right now, or should we move on, wait till we have questions?
I just need to know what a unit is.
Oh, okay. So a unit is a dwelling. So it could be a single detached home. It could be an apartment unit. It's a form of density calculation. So all the official community plans of the electoral areas, all the land use designations typically have a density associated with it, and it's calculated typically by unit per hectare. Right? And so finally, that 30 unit per hectare threshold is a really important one where we start changing from sort of that single detached form to something that is a little bit more common in sort of village situations or more urban type of areas where we start seeing multi-level buildings, perhaps apartment buildings as well, so townhouses, but attached multifamily units. And in these types of areas, we start to think about density, not just in units per hectare, but also in square footage and how much a building can cover a lot. So with these typical density thresholds, we then move into a new land use framework that helps us organize all of the existing land use designations that exist across the electoral areas. And we'll show you how we did that over the next few slides, but this is the logic that has informed this consolidation of approximately 166 land use designations into just about 20. So there's residential designations, there's a mixed employment one, commercial, industrial, civic, parks and open space, agriculture, and marine designations to cover the lot.
Those are hard to see. Can you make them just a little larger on your screen?
We'll go through them in the next few slides as well,
okay.
a little bit
Okay,
later
thank you.
on, so you'll get a better chance to see that. But this is just showing how they map along that transect graphic, right? So, for instance, the large rural designation here really kind of fits within that resource and natural and rural agricultural type of transect area within the Cowichan Valley. But we'll get to that in just a little moment here. So how did we get to those 20 land use designations, and how did we fit your existing designations into those 20? And that's a really big question. It's a big process as well. So this first slide, and I know this is also quite difficult to see, there's a lot of complexity here, but this is a graphic that was made by your team, by the CVRD's GIS team. Rashinda Woods, thank you very much. I just have to call her out for this excellent work, but essentially we untangled the web of existing designations and zones. And so we looked at, on the top here, top half, we have commercial land use designations that exist within all the electoral areas. And then underneath that, we have all the zones that are implementing that land use designation. They're ordered from left to right by density, but you can tell that there's not much logic into it because, you know, certain designations further to the right actually point back to many zones that exist all the way on the left. And so there's a lot of confusion in these graphics. There's a lot to untangle. There's a lot to understand. Similarly with the residential graphic down here. And so both of these graphics just show sort of the level of complexity that we're dealing with here in understanding the range of designations and how the implementing zones interact with those. Next, what we did is we pulled some of the existing density thresholds and the general intent that's written in the electoral area OCPs and those local area plans in an effort to see exactly what did they mean by, say, a mixed-use comprehensive development land use designation. What was the intent in that designation? What are the density thresholds that were explained within that document? And so we looked at those densities, we looked at the intent, and that helped us then organize those designations within the new framework of those 20 designations. So for example, here we have Area A, Area B, and Area C, and these are the residential designations on sort of from left to right, mapped within the new designations on the top. So from large rural to sort of a village residential low rise here. And then we refined and we adjusted those designation boundaries based on the MOCP goals, specifically goals such as, ensuring that we're linking servicing and land use and growth, specifically things around having vibrant village cores. And so, ensuring that growth is related to things like transit and amenities. And so these were all considerations as we started refining and adjusting those boundaries to the land use designations. So all in all, we have 7 residential land use designations. From a large lot rural designation, which is primarily around single detached homes, but really on large lots, large acreages with a maximum of 0.2 units per hectare. We have small lot rural at a density of about 1 unit per hectare, and then we shift into those suburban densities. So everything from large lot suburban to a compact lot suburban, which maxes out to around 30 units per hectare. And then there's our next threshold as we get into more village or urban style development, like the village residential, which then allows for things like duplexes and triplexes with densities around 25 to 50 units per hectare. And you could even see townhomes in this designation. And finally, as the most dense or compact land use designation, we have a village core, which looks at things like townhouses, but also stacked townhouses and perhaps apartments up to 4 stories in height. And so that would be a density of around 40 to 100 units per hectare, depending on the type of development. Then we move into 9 employment land use designations. And so this ranges from, a very low density type of crossroads commercial, the little corner store, perhaps in a rural area, the little community hub or community hall. So small scale buildings, maybe 2 stories in height. Then we get into things like general commercial, so large catch-all for a lot of different types of commercial, retail, large-scale format, style commercial development, and village commercial, which is really about a bit more of a compact form of village commercial retail streets that we see in places like Cowichan Bay and Shawnigan Village right in the core. We have a tourist commercial designation. And then we get into a mixed employment designation, which starts to allow for greater flexibility. So if that property has a mixed employment development, it can be either industrial or commercial, depending on the desire for that particular the market and how that property relates with its neighbors. We have 2 industrial designations. One that's focused on more light industry, so less polluting for instance, less impact on the surrounding properties. So it has the ability to be a bit closer to other types of land use designations like commercial or like residential. And then a general industrial, which is has a bit more of a heavy impact on its surroundings. So we try to put those in specific places where they won't have a negative impacts on resident populations or other uses. And finally, forestry and resources and agricultural land uses, which are really less about sort of the density, more about the intent and the purpose of resources and growing, obviously, food crops and other types of crops on our ALR lands. And finally, 4 civic and open space land use designations, so ranging from infrastructure like treatment facilities and pumping stations. We have an institutional designation for places of worship, recreation centers and schools, parks and open spaces for our large parks and playgrounds and trails and fields. And then finally, water designations to protect the water bodies that are so dear to this region and its residents, and obviously protecting things like the potable water supply and sensitive wildlife habitat. So we've given, we want to show a few examples of land use maps here, and then we'll go to questions. But the first map here is really showing electoral area B in its whole scale here. It's a little hard to tell at this scale, but when we move into Shawnigan Village here, what we can see is how these land use designations start to map themselves out, and how you start seeing that gradient of that transect sort of come through in the land use map itself. And so you see sort of at the core of Shawnigan Village, that village commercial designation, which looks at things like, that vibrant commercial street or commercial hub at the center of the village. Then with a few properties of village residential, so opportunities for a little bit of multifamily housing in those areas to support that commercial hub, that commercial center, with added, foot traffic. Then we see in this darker orange a bit of a compact lot suburban designation. So this is where we get into those more suburban type of densities, but still at a compact level, so up to 30 units per hectare. That's still transit supporting. It's still supporting of that commercial core in Shawnigan Village. And then we move into, a medium lot suburban, and then even further afar, a bit of a larger lot suburban type of density. Quite similar to what existed in many of those places in Shawnigan Village, that large lot type of format, very kind of rural character. But showing that sort of gradient, showing that transition from the village core outwards towards Mill Bay, and then to, of course, Cobble Hill to the north as well. Another example that we wanted to show here is electoral area G, in contrast to what we're seeing in a place like Shawnigan Village, where really the intent here is to, not have significant change. And so this is really the standard large lot suburban designation, which would essentially, allow Saltaire in this case to predominantly keep its existing settlement patterns, that sort of suburban type of development form that exists there, and to keep that as sort of the standard within this community without it sort of changing. We understand that there are certainly some servicing challenges in this area. We don't want to see a whole lot of growth in this area. It's not perhaps the most apt location for that. So really just thinking about a sort of clean designation that allows for what exists there today. And so with those examples and that framework of land use designations, I will now turn it back to you folks for questions.
Thank you. Any questions on the framework of the land use designations? I turn to Director Salmon and then Director Smith. Go ahead, Director Salmon.
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting. So manufactured home parks, very important for affordability and other reasons. Where do they fit in? Where would they fit in these designations?
So in many of our density calculations, the manufactured home parks typically fit under 30 units per hectare in terms of their unit count. So they would fit within anywhere from that medium lot suburban designation or that compact lot suburban designation.
Okay.
Thank you. Turn to Director Smith. Go ahead, please. Edward, do you have a question? Or do you have a comment? Oh, okay. I just see your hand up on the screen, that's all. Just in case I missed it. Go ahead, Director Smith.
Thank you. Can you hear me? I'm
Yep.
having trouble with my microphone again. I'd just like to go back to the map of Area G. I'm very familiar with it. I heard you say that the intent is not to have changes, keep its settlement patterns, what exists there today. So we have many small lots that go back in time in Area G in Saltaire. And then we have a little bit bigger than the smaller lot. And then the intent in Saltaire is the 1 unit per acre and the 1 unit for a hectare. And that was the intent so that we retain the rural green belt between Chemainus and Ladysmith. When you look at this, it turns into a large lot suburban 5 units per hectare, which is way over what we actually have now. So I'm really confused how you would all of a sudden say that, you know, existing there today, because now it's changed totally. And I was wondering how that could even happen. I know there's some details in the map that aren't correct, but those are other things I can talk about later. So can you explain how somebody came up with an idea of changing our whole community to not what it already exists?
So, yeah, through the chair to Smith, I believe, we are in this instance, that large lot suburban does go up to 5 units per hectare as a maximum, which is quite reflective of the subdivisions that have occurred there currently. So perhaps it's wrong to say that it's not intending any kind of changes, but it would be reflective of the existing settlement patterns that have existed there in the past.
Follow up, Director Smith. Go ahead, please.
The last subdivision that went through, they were all 1 acre lots, and the other one that's just going through is 1 acre lots. So I don't think that's reflective of the current. And I don't think we want to go back to the past. Being on septic systems, you only create more problems. We lose our climate adaptation ability with the vegetation that's in place. If we went to 5 units per hectare, we would clear cut the whole of Saltaire, and all it would be is everybody who sneezes hears the person next door when the person sneezes. I think that there's definitely I'd like to work with you to come up with putting back our actual 1 acre and our 2 acre, and through modernization we can come up with other things, but I don't think we should be changing it at this point.
Go ahead.
Well, that's a very good comment, and I would impress that we have the opportunity definitely to take a look at this at a finer grain, and to explore. Given some of these subdivisions are a little bit smaller than that 1 unit per hectare, we can look at certain places where we could reduce the densities in some of these areas. And ensure that, as you said, the green belt remains in place. I mean, that certainly is what we would hope to do, and so I'm happy to revisit this and look at how we can maintain that.
Thank you. Director Nicholson, go ahead, please.
Thank you. I think my question is similar to Director Smith. I am looking at small lot rural, which is 1 unit per hectare, which is 1 unit per 2.5 acres. And I know that a lot of the area that has got this yellow designation is actually currently, they have 5 acre minimums. And I would be uncomfortable if this designation means that people can move to more subdivision on some of this small lot rural area. to become much smaller than what is currently on the books, I would feel very uncomfortable about that for a number of reasons. So is that the intent here, or?
Go ahead, Patrick.
I don't think it would be. I believe that we've tried to match those designations as much as possible to this 1 unit per hectare sort of designation. We've seen it through certain land use designations like the Shawnigan Lake Rural Community Residential, which matches exactly at that 1 unit per hectare threshold. There's a few other examples of that. And so we could certainly revisit if there's specific areas that are of concern where you would specifically feel that rural subdivision may occur given that change in density. We would be happy to revisit that and maybe provide an update of those maps so that it's given that large lot rural designation. It is a bit of an art form, and it is a little bit of a, like, there certainly may be some areas that would be able to subdivide. So your concern is absolutely valid. If that is a concern, then so we would definitely be able to look at that in closer detail as well.
Follow up, Director Nicholson?
Well, yeah, I think that would be important because I'm thinking in particular things like along the river corridors and that kind of thing. And I think we have to be very careful about reducing or increasing the footprint in those kind of areas.
Thank you. I have Director Morrison and then back to Director Smith. Go ahead, Director Morrison. Oh, and then Director Martman.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and through you to our presenters. I just on the basis of the last comments, I think that we have some guidance on density and the likes from Island Health and their 0.4 hectare for properties qualifying for on-site sewer and water, and I think that's where a lot has been driven in the rural areas so far. But my question is, and I understand the regulatory aspect comes in the zoning, so that I'm fine with that. But we heard about manufactured homes. A current and increasing issue we have is the tiny homes and people parking RVs on other properties and the likes. And I know that's more around zoning and enforcement, but in this document, are we going to be seeing any comment or direction or intent around what's becoming an increasing housing lifestyle that people are pursuing?
Yeah, through the chair to Mr. Director Morrison, I believe. Sorry if I get the names wrong.
Okay.
But I don't believe that tiny homes have been a policy issue that we have looked at or explored through this modernization process.
Follow up, Director Morrison? Okay, I turn to Director Martman and then to Director Smith. Go ahead, Director Martman.
Thank you, and through to the presenter. I'm just looking at Area H, which is the Yellow Point area, and one of the concerns I see is, again, in the mapping of it, and much like Director Nicholson, just concerned about what things are large lot versus small lot rural. But one of the things I also notice is that there's no apparently acknowledgement of some of the water issues that we have in this area. Because we just don't have capacity we're all on wells, and there's no capacity to have more wells perhaps. So how does that, is this too early to talk about that, or is that another place to discuss it?
Through the chair to Mr. Martman, we did go, we can get into a little bit of what, of the reasoning and the rationale behind the growth containment boundaries, which are a little bit later. We certainly are aware of the water issues and challenges in that Yellow Point area, and we have done our best to try and match the land use designations to reflect some of those challenges. And so we certainly can talk about that in a bit more detail. We've specifically, I believe right around the Chuck Wagon sort of development area there. We certainly looked at opportunities to increase a few the customer count to the water services that exist in that area to make it a bit more resilient and sustainable. But we're certainly open to discussing that further as well.
Follow up, Director Martman?
Yeah, and exactly, there was one of the points around the growth containment boundary for the chuck wagon is that one of the areas for expansion is into what is designated as a water conservancy area. Hence my question in the first place. So yes, further discussion would be good.
Thank you so much. Turn to Director Smith. Go ahead, please, and then Director Nicholson. Go ahead.
Thank you. We've obviously opened Pandora's box here. I am just wondering, with the 7 residential land use designations, maybe what we're talking about is a few extra residential land use designations, and whether you're married to this 7 or not, or some of the other land use designations, are we actually having, so we have flexibility that we could add to these. And some of the concerns obviously are whether there's community water, community sewer. So if you had like the large lot suburban and it was 5 units per hectare, but there isn't water to actually build out to that amount, and there isn't even, and everybody's on septic. So those aren't in here for us to say, well, if you have community water, it can only be 2 units per hectare. You know what I mean? In that it's so, we've got all these mixes that are in all of our communities, and whether we have enough water, whether we have community water, all those things. So can you?
Go ahead, Patrick.
Through the chair to Ms. Smith. I think the intent of these maximum densities is not that you can actually achieve those densities at every opportunity. And so really what a land use designation density means is, under the ideal circumstances, that is your potential density, your max density. Whereas if you don't have servicing, if you don't have, say, or if you are on a property with, for example, an environmentally sensitive area, or if you have a pond on your property, or if there's other features on your property that prevent you from achieving that full density, then that would certainly lower your yield, much in the same way as it would a lack of servicing. And so I think that's implicit within the term of a maximum density. We're trying to stay away from having conditional densities at the high level that an OCP is meant to be, and that may be the kind of information or the type of rules and regulations that you could see in a zoning bylaw.
Follow up, Director Smith? Can I turn to Director Nicholson? Go ahead, please.
Thank you. So when our land use designations, what is the intent behind them?
So the intent of a land use designation is to express the type of use that may be that the land may be used for, and the density at which that building may be built to.
So it just strikes me, when you look at some of these areas, there are, glaring examples of poor past decisions that are not very in keeping with the surrounding area. For example, I'm looking at a compact suburban lot in the middle of a rural area, so it sort of sticks out like a sore thumb. So by saying that the land use designation will remain as a compact suburban, are we saying that that's okay, or is this an opportunity to maybe show what the designations really ought to be?
Go ahead, Patrick.
So in some cases, the designation is very much just a translation from past OCP designations, and I'd say for approximately 90% of the properties in CBRD, we've merely translated the original OCP land use designations in your existing OCPs into this new framework with relatively same density thresholds. In other cases, there may be a little bit of adjustment, a little bit of a change to try and achieve some of these MOCP goals related to servicing, related to fostering a complete community with more affordable housing and housing needs and those types of considerations as well. If I may also just respond to one to Director Smith's question around whether or not we'd be open to, exploring further designations, a greater number of designations of residential ones. I think that's definitely on the table. We have been trying to hold the line on the 20 just for specifically that simplicity's sake. We believe that it's possible to do it under these 20. But if there is a finer level of detail, I mean, I would also say that, when we get to that local area plan and neighborhood plan process, then there is also an opportunity to dig further on a block by block basis and to really dig in a little bit deeper on those density thresholds and perhaps establish a few extra designations that provide a bit more detail and provide a little more certainty around that density. But at the level of an official community plan, we are trying to keep it relatively high level and give that general intent as opposed to a very specific density threshold that essentially changes on a block by block basis.
And just to add to that, Patrick, part of the reason to avoid getting into too many, and not to say adding a few here and there is too many, but we want to the best of our ability, we want to load the heavy lifting to the zoning bylaw. So you have your implementing zones then that control at a finer grain, and then you would have a range of those implementing zones within the individual designations. So that's part of it as well. We know we will get into greater complexity within the zones.
Director Martman, go ahead, please.
Thank you. And so I just wanted to confirm, when you mentioned local area plans, is that something that will come to all areas? The reason I ask that is because when you read, I think it's 1.8, it talks about community character statements because some local area plans might not be necessary.
So I believe that is going to be determined at a later date once the local area plans and neighborhood plan process has been started. I'm not sure if Coralie can speak specifically to that process, but I think our intent is to try and create an OCP that can that covers and creates a bit of an umbrella for those local area plans and those neighborhood plans. So ideally, each electoral area would have perhaps a neighborhood plan, perhaps a local area plan, or perhaps I think for one of the electoral areas, a sort of water stewardship plan as well.
Ms. Breen, would you like to add anything? Okay, that's great. So it's now 2:30, so I think we'll take a 10-minute break and come back. Thank you. Turn off your microphone.
Thank you very much.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. And now we'll continue to the next section. Is it you again, Patrick? You're on mute.
Yes, for a short little while, and then we'll pass it on to Mark.
Okay, welcome back.
I'll just share my screen again. All right. So moving on to policy and performance metrics. So as mentioned earlier in the presentation, we've shaped the draft MOCP policies by the goals. And so each goal forms a policy chapter, from managing infrastructure responsibly to improving governance and implementation. And so we'll go through each one of those. But first, and as was mentioned previously, there is a social equity lens that has been applied to the policies. And so the way we've done that is After having written the policy, and many of the policies are transferred or have been transferred from the HOCP with some additional and supplementary and complementary policies to those existing ones. But what we've done is we've looked at those policies and we have marked the policies based on whether this policy is an equity policy and it should be perhaps prioritized, or if it's a policy that has potential implementation considerations attached to it. So, if you want to implement this particular policy, there's a checklist at the end in the implementation section that speaks to how you could implement that policy equitably, so that it impacts different groups in a similar way, and it doesn't disadvantage other groups. And so that social equity lens has been applied to the policy chapters of the MOCP. We've certainly heard some comments on that here today, and so we'll, if there are concerns about that, we're also, we'll listen to those, and we'll definitely consider that as we move forward. Just to say that yes, there are certain policies that could be prioritized if equity is a strong consideration, and there's also some policies that you may want to look at implementing in a particular way so they don't disadvantage certain groups. When we move into the first policy chapter of managing infrastructure responsibly, you'll notice each chapter is formulated in a similar fashion. So we speak about stresses to this particular goal, what will challenge us to achieve that goal. And then there's objectives, and then there's key topic areas that the policies are trying to address. And so the stresses for managing infrastructure responsibly are specifically life cycle considerations, the costs and sustainability of those infrastructure systems, the limits to capacity in certain areas. There's things like oversight and maintenance of those infrastructure systems, the increasing costs and the revenue shortfalls in certain systems, and then obviously the takeover of private systems as a major consideration in the electoral areas. Major objective here in this chapter includes responsible infrastructure management through long-range plans to address growth demands, operational efficiency, and obviously sustainability in terms of finances and environmental considerations. And so we see the key topics of water, wastewater, stormwater and drainage, and waste management in this section. I believe there's also a little bit on emergency services in this section as well. When we move to making distinct and complete communities here, some of the stresses that we've identified are urban, or even in some cases rural sprawl, housing costs as something that is increasingly a challenge in your region, but throughout the province really. And then also out of character development. So development that might not fit within a particular neighborhood, and wanting to make sure that we have policies that address that. The objective of this particular chapter includes, planning and design for communities that address resident desires for protecting the unique character of villages and landscapes, and enhancing affordability, health, and well-being, as well as inclusivity in our communities. Some of the key topics that this policy chapter addresses are housing, and in particular affordable housing, community design, childcare, arts, culture, and heritage, parks and recreation. And I know there's a concern a little bit about childcare being perhaps out of scope, perhaps out of jurisdiction. I believe the policies specific to childcare are, we can look at as objectives as opposed to policies, but are related to land use. And so for instance, in the zoning bylaw, we can permit childcare in a greater range of zones. And so there's there may be a policy in there or an objective that speaks to perhaps allowing childcare as a use in a greater variety of zones, specifically to encourage more childcare spots. It's not about the CVRD necessarily playing a role in the delivery of childcare spaces, but more around having the land use regulations permit it from happening in the first place. When we move into expanding mobility options, some of the stresses identified are around geography and population density and how that may not be amenable to certain types of mobility options, specifically transit or other forms of active transportation. Lack of authority, so you don't have a whole lot of power in terms of the right-of-ways. Those are owned by the Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure, but there are certainly certain things that that the CVRD can do within its regional powers. Another stress is that unintegrated land use and transportation system. So we're trying our best through this policy chapter to align where those bus routes are going, where those active transportation routes are, and how we can, best supplement those with some more compact or higher density land uses, so that we're encouraging people to use those types of systems. And then also identifying gaps in the trails network as an example as well of a stress. Some of the key objectives include encouraging the development of infrastructure for more sustainable modes of transportation, and also reducing car dependency as not only a benefit to healthy communities, but also benefit to the climate crisis and reducing our greenhouse gases. And so the key topics in this policy chapter are related to sustainable modes of transportation, like walking, biking, and using transit. And then obviously a few considerations around vehicles and car use as well. In the next chapter, around protecting and enhancing natural asset, some of the stresses around human footprint in natural areas, so wanting to reduce that footprint and have less of an impact. But also thinking about habitat loss, fragmentation, and degradation of those natural spaces. The increase in invasive species, and obviously the climate crisis causing challenges in the protection and enhancement of those natural assets. In terms of objectives, we are looking at the development of a natural asset framework as a tool to identify, prioritize, and protect, and also enhance sensitive ecosystems. This is a shift from just managing natural systems, but thinking of them as assets, and essentially being able to asset management strategies while ensuring the continued health of obvious watersheds and airsheds is very important to the Cowichan Valley. Some of the key topics in this policy chapter are the natural asset framework, which we've developed for this particular modernized official community plan. There's policies around sensitive ecosystems, watersheds and airsheds, and of course, the marine and foreshore is to be completed through, I believe, some work on the marine OCP in the future. Strengthening local food and agricultural systems is the next chapter. So some of the stresses related to this is the land conversion of agricultural lands and land use conflict as well. So where some of those adjacencies between agricultural and other uses might be harming agricultural productivity. Water resource availability to climate impacts, obviously creating some challenging circumstances for soils, lands, and the ability to grow crops. The availability of labor and farm worker housing, the rising cost of living and farming. We know how expensive it can be these days for young farmers to get into the business of farming. And finally, the lack of food processing infrastructure and connections to supply chains as well as a major stress in terms of our agricultural systems. The main objective here really includes the protection of agricultural land, specifically in relation to the Agricultural Land Reserve, and ensuring that there's sustainable practices while enhancing local food security. And so the key topics that we have in this policy chapter relate to agricultural lands, but also to food security. In terms of enhancing regional prosperity, the stresses that we've identified are related to rising global energy needs, and so ensuring that we can be resilient in the face of those rising global energy needs. The stress of high impact industrial areas and their impacts on potential residential or commercial areas, and those sort of negative impacts that sometimes cause conflict or friction within our communities. Bedroom communities is also being a bit of a challenge. So wanting to make sure that the population, the local residents, have jobs nearby and aren't necessarily fleeing to other regions or other neighborhoods to find jobs and find work. Seasonal tourism is also a bit of a stress if there's not a whole lot of activity during shoulder seasons. That can certainly cause stress in communities. And also a changing commercial sector. And so we know through COVID-19 and also just a longer term trend that large format, big box retail and other types of commercial services are slowly becoming less and less attractive in communities. And so especially as online retail takes a bigger sort of emphasis in our lives. And so wanting to make sure that there's a little bit more flexibility in our commercial lands is really important these days. So the objectives in this policy chapter relate to providing an adequate amount of employment lands to meet the needs of a growing population, and to also encourage emerging circular and green economy. So the key topics here, we're talking about employment lands, we're talking about a circular and innovative economy, one that is becoming increasingly sort of waste-free, and also tourism as a major economic sector in the Cowichan Valley. We also have the Mitigate and Adapt to the Climate Crisis policy chapter. So some of the stresses that we're feeling as a result of the climate crisis. So we're seeing impacts to water quality and quantity, threats to ecosystem biodiversity, risks to silviculture activity, but also to agricultural activity. This one is very much linked to a lot of the other policy chapters, but the objectives include reducing transportation, building, and solid waste GHG emissions as the most contributing sectors to your GHGs, and while also strengthening the region's climate resilience and adaptation measures to ensure that you're ready for a changing climate. And so some of the key topics here, climate mitigation, as well as policies related to climate resilience and adaptation. And finally, the last policy chapter involves improving governance and implementation. And so this is really your implementation section. It's where we talk about alignment with other plans that the CVRD holds. It speaks to relationship building, not just with First Nations, but also with other orders of government, and equitable implementation. So this is where there's a bit of an equity checklist to say, if you are thinking or considering implementing certain policies, you may want to consider some equity considerations, ranging from, ensuring that you're engaging or communicating with certain populations that are underserved, to other types of considerations. So, and then finally, monitoring progress, which involves the performance metrics, which I will now pass on to Mark Holland to present on my behalf. Go ahead.
Thank you, Patrick, very much. And I'll just ask you to advance the slides piece by piece. Good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be here to join the team at the end of a long, several years you were commenting on it to get here. I just want to offer a few slides here on the dashboard of metrics that we built for you to accommodate or accompany the policies. So essentially the goal of this dashboard of measurable metrics is to really quantitatively evaluate the effectiveness of the implementation of our policies. Given that our policies, we usually adopt them because we're trying to achieve a certain end. This discipline of numbers begins to help focus us to ensure that we are holding ourselves accountable to that kind of an outcome that we want. So essentially the scope was to establish a limited set of central keystone metrics associated with each of the policy topics or policy goals that we have. And I've included a brief quote here. I think many of you will know Peter Drucker, the famous management guru of when we were all much younger than we are today. And he just had this very famous saying, we manage to what we measure. If we aren't measuring things, then we can kind of waffle around a bit. As soon as we get crisp about it, then we really began to focus. With that comes an interesting challenge of whether we can get data and is it the right data, because if we're measuring the wrong things, then we can often not quite achieve the goals that we originally intended. Next slide, please, Patrick. So there's quite a bit of history here. We've been working on this set that I'll show you here, or that we will be touching on periodically as Patrick moves through the different policy areas in the rest of our presentation today. We have a set for you in the HOCP that we built, and we've now adopted some of those and added other ones for the MOCP, given its sort of new directions. So this has been being worked on for a couple of years with actually quite a few people working on this. Next slide, please. I want to specifically note the amount of effort that has gone into these. These are deceptively small and require a phenomenal amount of thinking and discussion and work. The CVRD team has been phenomenal. We have had numerous calls across the entire staff team, digging down into reports and data and trying to find a set that meet our criteria, which I'll talk about in a moment. We also had an entire team of people at Vancouver Island University working on this for a year with us, as well as the core consulting team who've all contributed and worked on this. And the foundation was the original report that Rennie did on growth and projections in the economy, and kind of set the whole stage for all of this process. So just a thank you to everyone and all the time you spent working with us to try and find the right numbers to put into this dashboard. Next slide, please. Just a few observations on the metrics here. They become kind of an interesting focus or almost flashpoint in some cases, and I'm sure there'll be some interesting discussion as we move through. And if today's not the time, I'm available to have a conversation in support of staff with any of you at any time to talk through some of these data points and how we found them and why they are what they are. We were focusing on just a few core criteria. First off, the information, while there's a lot of it available for any topic, as you can imagine, it needed to be directly linked to the goals that you as the community, you as the directors are trying to achieve. We need to find data points that really relate to what's important. The next two really became then tails that wag dogs on this one. The first one is that it has to be accurate. It has to be within the electoral area jurisdictions, which was quite a surprising component to all of this. And it has to come from a source that will be regularly updated. There's lots of information we could find that isn't regularly updated or came from one study or one book or one report, but that may never ever be done again. And the terms of the study that yielded the data may not be replicated. So it became quite an arcane process to dig into reports across the entire library of CVRD work and ministries and other EHA and other organizations to determine, is this within the CVRD boundaries? Particularly, can we get it per electoral area? And will it be accurately updated on a regular basis? And then finally, there was a set of this data which met the previous criteria, but would take so much CVRD staff time to access, process, clean, and organize the data that it became probably untenable, even though the reporting times are not going to be all that often. It began to get set aside to say that's just really unrealistic to ask for that much CVRD resources to try and crack just a couple of points of data, is as important as they may be. Next slide, please. So the selection process started with a huge number of a very significant large set of data and studies, and then we began to move them off to the side, based on irregular study cycles. The reports we could get were out of date, and we didn't know when the next one would come, if ever, not geographically accurate. A couple of others then, one other one just to note, there were some interesting points that we could get, but they were they yielded information that was so far outside of the CVRD control. And I think I want to just make a note here of those comments that were made at the very outset here by a number of you as directors, but the need to stay in our lane. It's part of the challenges of progressive governance is that, lots of things end up on the table, but we only have so many tools and very limited number of resources. So we removed various sets of data and metrics just because they were going to yield something that was completely out of your control. And while it was informative, it may not really inform decisions. And so a number of factors were removed over the course of time because of that. Now you can add more in the future. So that we've started with a core keystone set, a dashboard, if you will, keystone indicators. More can be added in the future if we can find them and you so wish to invest in them, because they become really critical to what you feel is important for leadership. Next slide, please. How often to report? I think primarily back to these criteria, a lot of it depends on who is harvesting the data and delivering it to you and how often that happens. And clearly the fundamental cornerstone of that one is going to be the StatsCan data. Patrick, I think we just lost an image there. We have a number of other sources, thank you. We have a number of other sources that form the cornerstones of your current Keystone set. VHA does community profiles about every 3 to 5 years. Some of it's StatsCan, but they actually do their own surveys. And what's great about the VHA one is that they actually liaise with you before they put out the survey. So additional points of data that you might want to get from the survey of your residents, you can get here, and they can be reported on an electoral area basis. This is a really, really important tool for you. BC community profiles, the provincial government is constantly tracking information and making that available. There's a whole set of data that's available for you on the electoral areas and on the CVRD generally. And then there are various special studies that do generally get done periodically that we can also access. We're recommending that essentially this report be done. Your OCPs typically are updated once every 10 years on average. Now, you obviously are in control of how often you update those. If we take roughly 10 years on average as a cycle, you'll have roughly 2 StatsCan cycles in that. So we're recommending that essentially the year after every major full StatsCan update, that it would be worth investing a few weeks of time for your planning and GIS staff to go through your dashboard, pull all the new data, and submit it to you as a report. This would give you essentially a midway report card on how your OCP goals and policies are being achieved and or what new issues are coming up to begin to set the stage for the next OCP update. Next slide, please. So a few just example metrics here, under, let's say, an objective area of managing infrastructure responsibly, we can look at a couple of different metrics or indicators. Say the percentage of population that is serviced by utilities, whether they're CVRD owned or private. Obviously, in keeping with your deep commitment in almost all of the electoral areas to a compact growth and maintaining your rural character, you can't get below 1 hectare lots if you're not serviced in some form. You can get quite a bit, you can get down to half that or significantly less if you have water and appropriate perk for septic. But then that requires municipal water systems, and they're expensive to install. And obviously, as we all talked about, the well fields or rivers or other lakes that are sources of those water are limited. So in this case, we can establish essentially a metric of the percentage of growth that is within the growth containment boundaries. Now, we haven't set targets for you in this process. When one sets a target, you automatically set policy and priorities. We can see this happening right now as we speak with COP and the whole discussion on climate change. When we establish a target beyond the metric, but actually say we want to achieve such and such a level, then it really begins to direct a whole lot of attention and resources. We are 100% fine with targets, but we did not feel it was our role to set them. As the directors of the region, should you wish to establish a few targets, you probably don't want them for every indicator, but it's up to you. Then, on issues that are really important, then certainly they can be rolled in, and then the policy path can then be unfolded backwards as to what it would take to achieve the target that you set. So in this case, we can hypothesize a target of 75% of all new growth would occur in areas where you can connect it to infrastructure. So you don't end up with thousands and thousands of people moving across your electoral areas in 1 hectare lots, and thereby resulting in significant impact to trees, water tables, roads, etc. Another one, solid waste stream statistics. These are all tracked very detailed within your region. So now your waste is trucked to mostly other regions for its final landfill home, but we can begin to track many of the different streams within that waste stream and begin to work on diverting those from landfills back into recycling or removing them from the stream altogether. And this monitoring metrics dashboard will give you feedback on a regular basis as to how well, what your waste profile looks like at any point, should you wish to reference it for a policy decision. Next slide. Okay, so I'll stop there and hand it back to Patrick, and happy to entertain questions on the policies and or the metrics as you wish.
Great, thank you very much. I'm just going to give you a couple pointers. There's just a couple of typos. I don't know if you want them now. One is on the reporting cycle, your years is wrong, and another one is cost, which is coast, just to help you out.
Apologies, that was a slide.
Thank you.
It's not in the proper draft. That was a slide mistake. My apologies.
No problem.
I will take responsibility for those typos.
No problem.
It's
Just
definitely
giving
not
you the
Mark. I
heads
put
up.
these together.
Sometimes
So
you look
thank
at,
you.
sometimes you look at things and you can't catch them. Somebody else has to.
Thank you.
You can look at them over and over again, and so I have Director Smith and then Director Morrison. Go ahead, please, Director Smith, and then Director Wilson.
Just wanted to ask a question. First of all, I like the word coast. It's much more better than cost, considering where Area G is located. I did have a question that might be for Patrick, is when we're looking at strengthening local food and agricultural systems, are we also looking at the inclusion of this people residents growing their own food on their own parcel, whether it's zoned agricultural or not? I mean, our property is a prime example of the amount of fruit trees we have, all the different, we have a massive vegetable garden. So are we encouraging those types of local food? Some people are looking for backyard chicken situations where they can sell their eggs or they have extra. So are we putting that in here also? Thank you.
Through the chair to Director Smith. Yes, absolutely. I think there's if I can find it, I believe there is some objectives as well as policies related to not just increasing food production on agricultural crops, but also increasing food production within our communities, whether that's through community gardens or other types of facilities within our villages and our centers, where there's opportunities to also grow food. And so that certainly is a focus, I believe, of that strengthening agricultural and food systems policy chapter. And one way to do that as well, while we can have sort of a higher level objective or policy, it also stems to or goes down to the zoning bylaw level, and whether or not the zoning bylaw allows for things like community gardens in certain zones or in a greater variety of zones. So that's certainly something that not only can the MOCP speak to, but as you review your zoning bylaw and seek to modernize it as well, there's an opportunity there to ensure that you're encouraging those types of local food systems.
Thank you. I turn to Director Morrison. Very exciting stuff.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is, I guess, for Patrick as well, and I'm just sticking with the things that are jumping out at me, and one was jumped out loud and clear. Under your make distinct and complete communities, you've got as one of the stressors urban sprawl. And, one of the things that we're grappling with, and it comes in a couple of different perspectives. It comes from, and it's rural sprawl, and it's the, agricultural lands used to be sacrosanct, and you farmed and the farmer lived on it. Now you're getting business opportunities and wineries and additional living residential and worker opportunities on those lands. You've also got the more rural resource that were formerly part of forestry operations that are now larger lot rural that have absolutely no services, and people are trying to shoehorn additional residential possibilities in there. So we've got a distinct rural sprawl issue, and as you were going through the slide deck and you were listing the stresses, I could have seen putting rural sprawl in a number of those categories. So what's being contemplated around that? And maybe it's coming later, but can you expand on what your thinking is?
Yeah. Through the chair to Director Morrison, absolutely. I think I I think I noted it as I was speaking, that rural sprawl is probably also a significant factor here. I would say that maybe the urban sprawl is more about the spillover effects from the Capital Regional District or from the Nanaimo Regional District as well, and maybe also with relation to the incorporated municipalities to a certain extent. But if we're thinking about the electoral areas, there's definitely a stress of rural sprawl. And I think what we're trying to do in order to address that rural sprawl is being very intentional about those density thresholds and where we want to target growth, where we want to focus it. And so as we get into the conversation around growth containment boundaries, what we are attempting to do is say anything that is within the growth containment boundary has to be at a certain density, and everything that's outside of the growth containment boundary should be above that 1 unit per hectare density and be a little bit more well suited for things like servicing, amenities, and community services. So I think it's really within the land use and within the growth containment boundaries that we're trying to address that rural sprawl issue.
Thank you. Follow up, Director Morrison, go ahead, please.
And quick follow up. Yeah, if we're going to discuss this in the urban containment or the containment boundaries, fair enough. I just know that we've actually made mistakes and allowed development in areas where there isn't adequate water supply and the likes. And I think some of us are getting to the point where if you don't have a sewer service and water service, then it should be almost a no-go zone. But we don't want to alienate people, landowners' rights to be able to live on a piece of property. But to go beyond the single residence on a property, maybe all the future growth should be within those areas that have services. And so it'll be a rigorous discussion at that point, I'm sure. Thank you.
Thank you. Director Wilson, go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. There's a couple of things. GIS, I think, is brilliant. It's a tool which we have to embrace fully, and the more use I see of it, the better. I've used it many, many times over the years, even from its infancy, and I've just seen explosion there. One of the things that was mentioned there was the priorities, and this is another thing that we've got to get straight. Let's set our priorities. Can we have this because we need it, or because it's a nice to have? Personally, if we need it, let's do it. If it's nice to have, well, let's just wait and see, kind of thing. Same with any household that has to make its spending priorities right. This is the same thing here, no different to anything else. One of the things that came up there, though, was the management of stormwater. At the moment, we have a situation throughout the island and throughout the mainland where we've got more rain than we can use, and it's all running away into the ocean. And I'm just wondering, within these plans, if there is any thought being given to actually capturing that storm water. Is there anywhere that we can start looking at the developments to store that water in the form of lakes or ponds or whatever, so that it can be used when we need it? I'm not talking about huge dikes or big storage areas such as Victoria's got, but I'm talking about the sort of the ponds, the natural areas where we can put water and save it for use later on, for whatever, for irrigation, that kind of thing. Has any thought been given to that particular thing?
Yeah, through the chair to Director Wilson. We have not looked at specifically at a policy addressing stormwater ponds or stormwater retention. There is that, I think, within the policy framework of an official community plan, oftentimes within development permit guidelines, for instance, there would be guidelines that relate to stormwater management, that relate to ensuring that when new development occurs, that it be done in a way that collects and distributes stormwater in a responsible and sustainable way, so that there's stormwater infiltration, for instance. And so that may be an area where that could be addressed. We could also absolutely explore, different policies that could speak to that particular challenge, but it is not something I believe that we have in this current draft.
Yeah, thank you very much. A quick follow-up, Madam Chair.
Go ahead.
Yeah, and that's great. I've seen the stormwater management plans, but they all seem to be basically a diversion of water away from an area that they really don't want it. There's nothing being done to conserve that water, and that's one of the concerns that I have. And that's something that I would really like to address as we go forward.
Follow up, go ahead, Patrick.
Yeah, and if I may, I think those larger sort of retention or detention ponds that you know, do collect stormwater are often much more feasible, say, in a much larger sort of comprehensive development, where you have quite a bit of greenfield development, right? Where you have the ability to shape the land a little bit in a larger, more complex way. Whereas when you are seeing more of the redevelopment of a single property here or there, it's a little bit more challenging to integrate those types of major pieces of infrastructure. So it would probably fit within some of those larger comprehensive developments that we would see, you know, maybe something, like the Paul D comprehensive development area, or the, or a few other examples throughout the region, but they aren't coming to mind right away. But yeah, typically those larger comprehensive developments are the ones that can accommodate those types of infrastructure.
Yeah, and that's the one that I was referring to. Yeah, and thank you for clarifying that. Yeah, if we can look into that, that would be great. Thank you.
Director Salmon, go ahead, please, and then Director Martman.
Yeah, thank you. So this is just on the broad question that we touched on, but I have to admit, when I first read this and saw things like social equity and childcare and a broad range of things, I was somewhat skeptical. But you know, listening and thinking about it a bit more, I really do support having these in the objectives category, not committing us to delivering or anything like that, but just as objectives. And I just wanted to, as I was thinking, a couple things. There's a little a childcare operation near here, down the road. I was talking to them. They've got 71 families on their wait list, and that's pretty standard apparently from what they say, with all around the area of South Couch, and you know, thinking broadly what we want in a healthy community. That's a range of ages, and I know with affordability for young families. You know, and they add in, they don't have childcare, they have to drive to Langford, drop the kids off. It's really, you know, it's really important that we keep all these in mind, what we want in our community. It's last comment, but if we retirement community is where we're headed according to the stats. I was quite surprised to see that all the growth South Couch and from around in 2030s and 65 age plus group. So I think it's really important for us to keep all that in mind. Thank you.
Thank you. As a grandmother of 8, I hear childcare is always an issue. So I turn to Director Martman. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. And through to the presenter, I'm interested in specifically about the policy and the performance metrics. I know we have an attachment B to our material, and I'm interested, at some point, are we going to go through these, or do you want some feedback on those? Because I have some thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. We don't have them on screen specifically, but we're happy to talk about some of these indicators today.
Is this the time though? Is this planned to do this today, or is there a better time? I guess I'll give you an example. Under strengthening local food and agricultural systems, I'm wondering if one of the metrics would be about how many farms have farm status, and using that as idea of production or productive use of land.
Yes, through the chair, it's an excellent point. We had a lot of discussion about farms and farm status. How many were under an environmental program was one of them in order to track their use of water. I think the one that we had settled on was using primarily provincial stats and some census stats to talk about how many farms are actually producing food. This becomes, I think, as you well know, and I'm sure you're well experienced in this, there's a significant amount of ALR land and farmland that is not under food production. Obviously, our favorite pets as horses use up quite a bit of it, and there's nothing wrong with that. The farmland stays as totally viable farmland. But how many are actually producing food? which kind of gets to the point that you're after, which is you can't have farm status unless you're actually producing a certain measure of food. So I think that's an excellent suggestion for a stat, and that's certainly something that we would be able to have repetitive, have it available, and have it accurate through the provincial authorities.
I guess I would advocate that we have a bit of time set aside to go through these at some point. I don't know about your other directors, but I know for myself, I think these metrics are going to be very important to us, or in terms of decision making, or at least tracking as you say, which policies are working. So I'm not sure how that would be arranged, but would be my choice.
Thank you. And I'm seeing no other hands up or any other questions. Oh, Director Kuhn, go ahead, please.
Yes, I don't know if this fits in here, but I'm just looking at the advocacy policy, CC 35 and so on. It's kind of a wish list as to what we would like to possibly see. But some of the items kind of irk me in that. One of them is CC 40, advocate to the province and ICBC for mileage-based vehicle insurance. Now, the regional district is quite a bit of rural properties that are kind of way out. We're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot here if we say, oh well, we want mileage-based insurance, and yet we actually take longer trips than any people that live in the city. So I don't know. And there's some other items on there that I'd like to actually go through and say, well, how many of those can we eliminate? Because it just clutters up the OCP. I mean, yes, we want this. Yes, we have this wish, and let's concentrate on what we actually want to achieve, and let's do away with some of the dreams there, because we know many of these dreams will never come through. It's just like, oh, we want this, yes, please, but we're not going to get it. So let's get kind of onto our feet there, and then deal with the details and take some of that out. Thank you.
Director Wilson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yep, what he said.
I kind of thought that. Okay, is there any more to the presentation? That is it? No other questions?
Yeah, we can move on to the growth containment boundaries, the final part.
Go ahead.
All right. I'm just going to share my screen once more. All right, so now moving on to the final piece of the presentation here on growth containment boundaries. So we wanted to start off with a few statistics just to, you might already be aware of this, but it's really just to hammer home the point, I think. From 2011 to 2016, approximately 67% of population growth and 78% of dwelling growth happened or was occurring outside of the growth containment boundaries. And so, and then when we were looking at, and our excellent GIS team, Liquor Geospatial, is with the help of the CVRD's GIS team, also analyzed dwellings that have been constructed since 2017 and found that approximately 58% of units were built outside the GCBs. So it's quite obvious that the GCBs have not been doing, I think, the job that they were intended to do, which is to focus growth within them. We wanted to show a bit of an example of this, and it's not to pick on electoral area B or any electoral area. This is just something that's common throughout the electoral areas, where you have the GCB as it is today, as shown as this red line, and then when you look outside of that GCB, you see quite a bit of settlement, quite a bit of subdivision, and some significant development that has occurred outside of there in ways that probably doesn't reflect that rural character or reflect those rural lands in the way that that you would expect outside of a growth containment boundary. And so this is just really to show that these types of patterns, it's not unique to the Cowichan Valley, it's not unique to electoral area C, but it is something that we want to try and prevent through this modernized official community plan. And so some of the principles that we looked at as we were assessing the realignment of these growth containment boundaries was about linking servicing with growth, so ensuring that where investments in water and sewer infrastructure can be supported by future growth, we want those spaces to be within the growth containment boundary. focusing growth in strategic locations. So that means near village centers, near jobs, public transit, and other community amenities. We wanted to formalize existing development patterns. So ensuring that growth and subdivision or where growth and subdivision have already occurred, that we try and formalize those. We can surround them by a growth containment boundary and try and prevent that further sort of rural sprawl. Ensuring densities outside of the growth containment boundaries are reflective of rural land use patterns. So again, this is where we establish that threshold. So once you overlay the growth containment boundaries with the land use designations, what you'll see is that those rural land use designations, the large lot rural and the small lot rural, are all outside of the growth containment boundaries. And then ensuring densities inside the growth containment boundaries are reflective of suburban and urban land use patterns. So the land use designations within the growth containment boundaries are above that 1 unit per hectare threshold. And so really trying to stay within those principles as we update the growth containment boundaries. One of the things that we did to help supplement this analysis was 3 staff workshops with the CBRD staff, your excellent group of engineers and development planners who, were helping us understand water supply servicing challenges, land use details, and development applications that have either come and gone or are in the pipeline or other things, just so that we could have a better understanding of the region and of the electoral areas as we make these types of changes. And so you'll notice in this particular draft, there's several objectives linked to growth and the growth containment boundaries, specifically that we would not support further expansion of the GCBs, that growth should be focused within the growth containment boundary, that it be focused within existing centers and residential neighborhoods with some greenfield sites that are available for future development. And then also that growth would not be occurring within floodplain or hazard areas as well. So we've got a few examples of maps here. Specifically, this shows the South Cowichan, so electoral areas A, B, and C. And really making the case here for linking servicing to the growth containment boundary. I think that's most evident specifically between Shawnigan Lake and Mill Bay, where there is the liquid waste management plan that's being considered, but also in linking sort of Shawnigan Lake to Cobble Hill. And so here we see an entire, rather large change in the growth containment boundary that would essentially link these 3 communities together. And really just thinking about how this is an area which is experiencing the most amount of pressure in relation to growth pressures, and also just those areas north of Shawnigan Lake, kind of in between Cobble Hill and Shawnigan Lake, also being places that we identified as having a relatively good supply of water and being able to accommodate a little bit of that growth. Similarly, Cobble Hill sort of reaching out onto the other side of the Trans-Canada Highway there into areas where quite a bit of subdivision has occurred, and so formalizing some of that area, and also looking at opportunities for a little bit of employment growth along the Trans-Canada Highway there as well. Another example that we wanted to show this afternoon is the growth containment boundaries for electoral areas F and I. So thinking about expansion here again into areas where at least for the case of UBO and electoral area I, where there has been quite a bit of subdivision, quite a bit of development, specifically around tourism and sort of cottage homes. And so including those types of development patterns within the growth containment boundary and trying to contain them from expanding any further, but also looking at electoral area F here, Honeyboon Bay and Missachi Lake with the new sewer system coming in, looking at linking those 2 communities and having a little bit more room for growth there, and perhaps a little bit more population density in those areas. And so with that, obviously there's quite a few other examples that we could have gone through, but in the interest of time, we felt that we would show those 2 examples as perhaps the most impactful changes to the growth containment boundaries, but we're happy to talk about that and speak to any questions that you might have.
Great, thank you so much. Is there anyone with questions? Director Morrison, go ahead, please, and then Director Smith.
Hi, thanks. Through the chair, this may seem really obvious, but we're talking about some, substantial change in attitudes. And especially in this segment, it's clear that we want to link growth to services. Brilliant. I'm trying to expand services in those core pink areas that you showed on the last slide. You don't have to bring it up again. But we've got an awful lot of folks in the, maybe not all 85,000 that we have, but they've got theirs. They've moved here. They've got their slice of heaven. They want to pull up the drawbridge, and they don't want any change. And we're talking about some pretty substantial change. Like, I don't think there's a 2-story building in Honeymoon Bay or Massachi Lake, but there probably should be. And the first public hearing you go to with a 2-story building, you're going to have all the boo birds come out and say, no, we don't want that change. We like it the way it is. So we're going to have a pretty tough sell to take this to the next level when it's presented to the community to say, here's some strong planning principles and how we can go together with the united. We'll have our individual community plans and the likes, but this is pretty strong stuff, and we'll face pushback. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, through the chair to Director Morrison, I would absolutely agree that these are bold changes. And I would also argue that given the past and how the growth containment boundaries have been treated, I would say that this is also a more certain and consistent approach to planning. So perhaps the messaging for community members is to say that if you have your slice of heaven, this is a much more consistent or clear way of ensuring that if you're in the growth containment boundary, there are certain things that you can expect. If you're outside of it, you wouldn't expect any more rural sprawl either. And so it really is about ensuring that we're focusing that growth in places where we want it. And certainly these growth containment boundaries are also drafts. We can explore through the community circles, through community engagement, whether these lines are in the right place, if they should be tailored further, if they should be pulled back a little bit further. But I think, given our analysis, this is what we've come up with in terms of a first draft.
I have Director Smith, then Directors Wilson. Director Smith, go ahead, please. Mute.
I'd like to point out Area G. We didn't have a growth containment boundary, and now we have all of Area G as a growth containment boundary. So I think that that's something that we need to have a discussion on, because it seems like an awful lot for one area, and that maybe we can have a bit of a discussion whether all of Area G should be the containment area, or whether we should try to pull back. We only have a limited amount of water, and we also have septic systems for everyone. So it's definitely a complicated situation. So I'm not sure how you thought we would all fit in that growth containment boundary. Did anyone have any comments on that?
Go ahead,
Thanks.
Patrick.
Yeah, through the director, or through the chair to Director Smith, I think the intention with Saltaire, and it is a bit of a challenging circumstance because electoral area G, there's quite a bit of subdivision that exists there today within a very sort of suburban pattern of densities that reach quite far beyond the the 1 unit per hectare in certain cases. And so maybe those are the areas that should be slated for within that growth containment boundary, perhaps linking, as we reassess the land use designations, as we explore a little bit further, as you mentioned, that green belt and those rural lands, that then maybe that reassessment of the growth containment boundary could happen in concert with that.
Director Wilson, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, I'm just looking at the slide which shows the areas A, B, and C on the growth containment boundaries, and I'm a little bit confused here because if I've got this right, the growth containment boundary in pink, and then there's another one below that which says Bylaw 47 growth containment boundary, kind of shaded grey. Which bit is the grey? And more to the point, this basically, if I'm reading it right, everything is built up in that area anyway. So that basically, does this exclude everything outside of that boundary? If you can pull up that particular slide, you can explain to me what it actually means. You know the one I'm talking about?
Yes.
Yeah. Now, if you zoom in on area C there, you can see that, all right, you zoom out a little bit. It excludes most of area C. And
Yeah,
you're talking about growth within that pink area there. Well, it's all grown up anyway.
So the intent between on this map here is to show that the lighter pink that you see is the existing growth containment boundary.
Okay.
That's included within the HOCP. So it only goes out to the Trans-Canada Highway here, and then it kind of ends at Cobble Hill Road here.
Yep.
And so what we're showing with the new dotted red line here is an expansion of the growth containment boundary out into lands that, yes, might have a dwelling unit on them, but they're larger kind of estate sort of lots, right?
Okay, yeah.
And they have potential for quite a bit of subdivision at a particular density. And so what we're saying is that there may be an opportunity on these lands here to see a little bit more development, specifically to accommodate some of the needs of the housing projections in this area.
That's an interesting one. And I think this goes back to what Director Morrison was saying. I've got my bit, you leave me alone kind of thing. But okay, that needs a little bit more looking at. Thank you very much, Patrick.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's important to, if I may just one more comment. I think it's important to note that many of our efforts these days in terms of when we're trying to accommodate growth is to try and accommodate it in places as close as possible to existing service centers, to existing jobs, in places close to transit, and certainly right next to the Trans-Canada Highway, right next to the Cobble Hill Village. This is an area that would be really attractive for a little bit more population growth, and so we felt that this would be a good place to accommodate that, rather than looking for big greenfield sites that might be out of the way of some of these services and out of the way of some of these community amenities. So that's part of one of the principles, one of the major objectives of this particular strategy. Thanks.
Great. Should we turn to Director Nicholson? Go ahead, please.
So just along that line, going out with this as a draft to the community, and I am wondering what kind of information that you've based it on a water supply point of view, and has the province been involved in this? Because it seems to me that we might be setting ourselves up for a problem.
Yeah, so through the chair to Director Nicholson, again, we held several workshops with staff, and their expertise during those workshops signified to us where they felt there was either certain levels of water supply that could accommodate further subdivision or greater population growth. And so through that process of workshopping these sites with CBRD staff, and through also looking at where water is currently serviced and where it wouldn't be perhaps a huge challenge to link some of these additional places to existing servicing. This is sort of the result of that analysis.
Okay, seeing no other hands up, go ahead. Oh, yes, Director Martman, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. And I'm just looking at the growth containment in Area H, and probably it applies to other areas as well. But particularly, it's where these growth containment starts to push up against agricultural land. And I'm interested in how the priority is set, because I know there's a number of policies in here that sort of prioritize agricultural purposes. And yet it seems to me that you're trying to put density or increase these area of living right up against farms. And then also that's one area. And then the other one is in the one around the diamond, we call it around Ladysmith Harbor. It looks actually like it's agricultural land that's now included within the growth containment boundary. So I'm just interested in both, like those, your opinion on those.
Yeah, so through the chair to Director Martman, it's certainly not an intention to include any kind of agricultural designated land within the growth containment boundaries. So if there is a specific property that is designated agriculture, it shouldn't be in the growth containment boundary. So we can certainly revisit that and make sure that there are none. But I believe, I mean, if we're talking about the large property in the Diamond area, just on the western edge of the Diamond area, is that correct? Yeah, I'm under the impression that that was designated as a residential property. So we could take a look at that. It might just be you know, a bit of an error in the GIS data, but we can certainly review that. In terms of the interactions between growth and development with agricultural lands, it is certainly important and preferable to also include as an additional layer to land use policy, protection of agricultural development permit guidelines, which often can include or provide guidance around buffering, so that there are fewer impacts between those residential uses and agricultural uses. And so, you know, in this particular area, in Area H, we're not talking about densities that are going to bring, you know, townhouses or multifamily type housing. We're talking about still, you know, a smaller lot, 5 unit per hectare type of suburban development, which typically doesn't have too much of an impact on agricultural land, typically has quite a bit of landscaping in and around the property there. So it may not be as huge of an impact as, say, if it was sort of a much more sort of multifamily, high intensity sort of urban use. But certainly through development permit guidelines for the protection of agriculture, there is a way and a method to mitigate some of those impacts.
Yeah, we've learned a few lessons there too. I have Director Morrison and then Director Nicholson. Go ahead, please, Director Morrison.
Madam Chair, my question is more of a general nature that's not pertaining to the actual containment boundaries. Or can I could hold off on it if others, or do you want me to just go ahead now?
Go ahead.
Thank you. We haven't talked much in this presentation, and as I said at the beginning, I haven't digested the whole document, but we are a pretty unique regional district with the private managed forest land holdings. And you know, they have a huge impact on a lot what goes around, especially, well, throughout the region. And I'd really like to hear if you've had specific focused discussions on that particular topic and the merit of inclusion of a statement, reference, whatever in this document. And my purpose for asking is this. We have people move here from, you know, all over the province and the world that are dealing in crown land and, you know, forest resource roads, and none of those exist. We have very little crown land in this regional district, and we are constantly hearing pressure from our residents that think that a forest is a forest is a forest, and they don't understand the distinction that those are private lands that are owned by mainly multinational companies or pension funds they're not crown lands. They don't have easy regular access to it. They operate under different legislation, and yet they're omnipresent in our lives. They're all around us, and they're huge. So what discussions, what thoughts around inclusion as to a statement or a policy or something in this OCP have you contemplated?
So through the chair to Director Mortensen. So you raise a very good point, which is that private managed forested lands are obviously outside of the jurisdiction for the most part of the CVRD's powers. We certainly can include advocacy policies that speak to ways in which we might interact with them, ways in which we might want to ensure that things like big logging trucks don't negatively impact our communities, ways in which we can ensure that logging doesn't cause unintentional impacts in terms of landslides and those types of environmental impacts on or near our communities either. However, it is certainly a challenging question given the lack of jurisdiction that we have as a regional district.
They're also like farmlands because they're also harvesting a product. Director Morrison, go ahead.
Just a quick follow-up, and I'm not saying I'm in particular favor or against any one of the the activity on the private managed forest lands, but it's the increasing pressure from the people who live in this area that are wanting to know what this document is going to say around that, and because we're having more and more people who are taking active positions on whether they're pro-forestry or anti-forestry, and it's a unique mix because it's mostly all private, and I could just as easily see a document that doesn't have a statement about private managed forest lands. That will leave an awful lot of people asking why there isn't a statement, but we don't have the jurisdiction. It operates under a different act of legislation. So I think some clarity and a well thought out and well discussed position on this is something that we should be exploring. Thanks.
Go ahead, Patrick.
Yeah, so through the chair again, through to Director Morrison, sorry. There is a few statements in the document that speak directly about PMFL lands. There's a jurisdiction component that explains that separation of jurisdictional powers and the orders of government. There's also some general policy specifically around, working with the province and PMFL owners to discuss long-term impacts of climate change and the region's natural resources on our communities in terms of natural hazards and those types of things. So there are a few mentions within the document that speak to that. There's advocacy policy for asking for a greater voice for local government in protecting environmentally sensitive areas on private managed forest lands, advocating for the PMFL Act to be revived to take into consideration the long-term sustainability of water supply and quality. So there are certain mentions and statements within the document that speak to, wanting to make sure that while we don't have necessarily all the control on those lands, that we can maybe go to the province and say, these are concerns that our residents have, and they should be aware of those. So,
Edward, did you want to add anything? I saw your hand up. Maybe Patrick answered it for you.
Beautifully, thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, we turn now to Director Nicholson. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. I am curious about the growth containment boundaries. There's several little small ones along the Trans-Canada Highway that reflect some probably poor choices in zoning historically. And I know in particular in my community, the Bench Road Tim Hortons is one of those areas. And it just strikes me that designating it as part of the urban containment boundary, these little small pieces, looks odd, and it might be misleading because I don't think the community is up for necessarily that kind of dense development, more than what is currently allowed and is going to happen. Yeah.
Through the chair to Director Nicholson, I believe so. We definitely had some challenges in front of us when we looked at the original urban containment or growth containment boundaries in Area D and E, which I believe is what you're looking at is along that Trans-Canada Highway, a few spots of growth containment boundary at sort of major intersections with the Trans-Canada Highway. It certainly was a bit of a challenge. Those are existing areas that were located within the existing growth containment boundary. So the question there was, do we remove those? Do we try and integrate them into a broader or bigger growth containment boundary? Or do we leave them as they are? And so, what I'm hearing from you is maybe there's an opportunity here to say, actually, this isn't where we want any kind of future growth to happen. So perhaps we should remove them from the growth containment boundary. That's certainly a question that we could look at. It's something that we could certainly contemplate and consider as we move forward with these. And
yeah, I think that's probably important because I've heard loud and clear that people like to be able to drive along the highway and not have all sorts of, intersections all the time with these little tiny developments that slow traffic down. And I really do think we need a corridor plan, a specific plan for the Trans-Canada Highway and Highway 18 for that matter.
Okay, I'm seeing no other hands up. So where are we now? Is that the last? Do we have any more,
so
Patrick? That's it?
So that brings us to the end of our presentation.
Okay.
I believe, if there are further comments, perhaps over the nature of the entire document in relation to this presentation, in relation to the responses and the questions, we're happy to answer any kind of overarching questions as well.
Okay, thank you so much. We're turning now to question period, and I believe we have one person that has a question for us, for the chair. Director Nicholson?
Well, before we do that, do you think I could have some clarification on where we're going to go with this? Like, I'm not really, the next steps for providing input on and some of the details, because I agree with Director Martman. I really would like to have a lot more time to talk about indicators and a lot of the specifics on my maps. I think I need some clarification on.
Okay. Ms. Breen?
Through the chair, I'd just like to thank the presenters. The intention now is that we're asking all directors to review materials relative to their areas, provide comments back to myself, and we will be finessing the documents before the plan is to go into community circles consultation after Christmas. So we're planning for that right now. And we can arrange additional sessions, special ESC sections for kind of more of a microscopic look into, for example, growth containment boundaries or the indicators. The intention today was to provide a really high level overview of the documents that we are suggesting go to community consultation after Christmas. But as you can see, each one of these areas, there's been weeks and months of work into them, and they could be a session unto themselves in terms of the complexity of them. The growth containment boundaries, we could easily spend 2 hours on those in a session. And I think Mark would say at least 2 on the indicators as well. So we can do those if the directors wish. But But in the interim, just please provide the comments, and the intention is to go out with these documents into community consultation after Christmas.
Thank you. I think we're needing some more time as directors as well. So I have Director Kuhn and then Director Martman. Director Kuhn, you have a question? I went Director Wilson.
Yeah, I don't know if everybody else is interested, but I would like to have a printed copy. And I think once
We talked about that already, yes.
yeah, once we have that, I think then we're much better prepared to have another discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll request that from staff. Director Martman, then Wilson.
Thanks for the information, and I look forward to learning a lot more. I think maybe I'm coming into this new, but I also feel that all the policies that are written and all the work that's gone into this has been immense, and I'm trying to wrap my head around which ones I would have concern to not discuss further before the community sees it. Maybe it's the right thing, maybe it's not, maybe it's something needs to change. And I really would look forward to having sessions that maybe chunk up the OCP. I don't want to lose sight of the whole document, but to be able to walk through and say, okay, we're going to talk about this section now, we're going to go over these policies. Then we could come truly prepared and say, yes, this is the one about ICBC, and we're going to talk about that one further, or not. And I guess the other piece I would put into it is that Thursdays have typically been put aside for any special electoral, and so I'd prefer that also be to follow that as well.
Thank you so much. I turn to Director Wilson. We'll look into that, Director Martman. I think that's a good idea. And then Nicholson. Director Wilson
Thank
and
you.
Nicholson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, and I'm just going to reiterate and urge directors. I'm going to look very, very carefully at this one, and basically to urge the directors to stay within the mandates, within the things that really matter to us, and stay away from social planning, social reconstruction, whatever it is, living wages. It's not within our purview, and it's certainly not within our powers to do anything about it. And, people can shake their heads as much as you like. It doesn't matter. We're not here to deal with the world's problems. We're here to deal with the local problems that we are facing, the ones that we should set priorities on. Thank you.
Director Nicholson, go ahead, please.
I look forward to that conversation, Director Wilson. I am wondering about the community circles, and I am wondering about how are we going to handle, are we going to be providing printed copies for the community? And when is this material going to be available that we've seen today? Is it going to be on the website now, or is it going to be revised before you put it up on the website? And how is this going to integrate with the community circles? And what can we do to help get that ready?
I believe we're streaming live at the moment, are we not? Yes, we are. Does anybody else like to add anything? Ms. Breen, go ahead.
Through the chair. So for the past 2 or 3 months, we in community planning, Alison Garnett and myself have been working on building the web platforms for Bang the Table, which is the engagement platform. These documents will be uploaded onto that platform. And starting around mid-December, we'll be launching a social media campaign to make the communities aware of these. So they are in the public, as of Friday when these documents were posted on Prime Gov, they're in the public domain. That website will, so this is replacing PlaySpeak. It's very clearly outlines the process for folks by electoral area to sign up for CBRD-led community circles on the policy areas. There'll be 2 in each electoral area, or they can arrange for their own community circle in their electoral area. And we are providing facilitator training. The workbooks will be posted online. They can be completed online. They will be assimilated electronically online, or there'll be hard copies available for pickup. And I'll have to arrange with that based on COVID friendly, whatever the situation is at the time, but it will all be available online fairly shortly, within the next 2 or 3 weeks. Now, soon thereafter, there'll be CVRD-led community center or community circles on the local area plans as well. So right now, we're looking at 2 per electoral area in January and February, led by CVRD staff on each of the policy areas, on the documents that were talked about today. Separately, there will be 2 for each electoral area on the local area plans and the growth containment boundaries. Those are just the CVRD ones. So those are 4 for each electoral area, plus the additional ones. We know from other municipalities who've recently conducted community circles that there is a big uptake voluntarily in communities. So we're anticipating a large uptake, but we will have very clear instructions very simply on the Bang the Table site when we launch that in 2 or 3 weeks.
Follow up, Director Nicholson, go ahead, please.
Thank you. My other question about the community outreach is how have you thought about how we could possibly get the Cowichan tribes, or at least in my area, they're a large component of my area. So how are we integrating with their community?
The Chair, we are discussing that right now, the strategies for that, the communications. We have talked to Cowichan tribes, but we will be, and I believe, I don't know if Alison Garnett's on this WebEx today, but she's going to be leading that process for us.
Okay, Director Acton, go ahead, please. And then back to Director Wilson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to add that I really appreciated the infographics. I think those were very well done and made a lot of points really clear. I'm still not completely clear on the fact, so for example, for Shawnee and Lake, the containment boundary, we've had so many amendments to our OCP that it has kind of spread out a bit. I'm not sure if going forward, we're going to be able to discourage that in a stronger way with this plan. But I guess that might become clear also when we have some hard copies and to be able to really look at the details.
That's a comment. I don't really see. Okay, I'm turning now to Director Salmon and then Director Morrison. Anybody else I've missed? Director Salmon, Morrison, and Wilson. Go ahead, Director Salmon.
Sorry, Madam Chair. I thought I was next after
Go
Director
ahead,
Acton.
Director Wilson. My
Thank
pages
you very
are getting all.
Yeah. Yeah, and question for Coralie there with the bringing in of Bang the Table. The Play Speak platform was a complete disaster, and it was very easy to manipulate. So what? How are we going to ensure that there's no outside influencers or input from outside of the CVRD, the people who really have very little say in what we do within our organizations? And I'll be quite blunt about this. I'm referring to the outside interest groups, the special interest groups with their own agendas. How do we stop that from happening here? It should be us, not them, not from outside and all the rest of it. I'm trying to stop any kind of manipulation here.
Through the chair, Director Wilson. The Bang the Table platform does request postal codes in terms of participation. We don't, residential addresses can be added, but they're not required, but we are requesting postal codes. There will be some groups that may submit comments that are outside of the jurisdiction. There may be some stakeholders and they will be separately accounted for. So we'll be screening that. It'll be difficult to totally preempt that type of involvement.
Yeah, and follow up, please, Madam Chair.
Go ahead.
does place speak take into consideration? I can put in any postal code I want to, but is there any correlation then between the IP addresses? Is there anything as sophisticated or as that, or can I just say I live in Cobble Hill? There's my
I
problem right
believe,
there.
yeah, sorry, through the chair, I believe that there is that correlation possible.
Okay, and I'd like to see that if possible, please. Thank you.
Director Salmon, go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, two quick ones, but one, could it be appropriate to have a scenic roadway thing in this type of stage of the OCP? I'm thinking, of course, of the scenic Malahat Drive, but there could be others.
Through the chair, I think in the instance specifically in Malahat, it is already designated. And so for the purposes of the OCP, since we are talking about land designation, we could include it as a designated highway, even though it's not within our jurisdiction, but we'll certainly make sure that that's included in the Area A, local area plan, and that there's narrative about it in the Schedule A, the first portion of the MOCP. And for folks that may not fully recall this, because it might have been buried somewhere in a package in the December or the July director's package, staff will be bringing forward 2 bylaws on the Malahat protection and view corridor protection in 2022 to complement this narrative in the MOCP. But in terms of other areas, we know there's interest for Highway 18 and some other areas, and we'll certainly that it's on the list to address. Thank you.
I turn to Director Morrison to close, I believe.
Sorry,
no,
Madam
Director
Chair.
Smith. Follow up, Director Salmon. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I actually had a second question, if I could. It's a follow-up, really. Director Acton, I think, raises a point I've been concerned about, and I don't know if there's anything that can be done at all, but the amendments, after we get all this work done, is there any way to sort of say, okay, now we've got a new OCP, we really don't want future, say, the growth containment boundary, we really want to stress there will not be, other than our usual practice, which is to look at each application as it comes, and often we do amend and go against what we've said. So I'm just wondering if there's any way to address that broad issue.
Go ahead, Ms. Breen.
Yes, through the chair. The OCP policies of whatever they end up being in terms of X amount within the containment boundary and Y outside are meant to be guiding policies. It's then really relies on the decision making of the directors in terms of when it's going to be and to what degree it will be strictly observed. So it at this point it's about a policy decision in which folks agree that it's the best approach in terms of growth management. There also are a lot of infrastructure related issues and costs related to that. So in terms of long-term planning, it's best to ascribe to it in the best possible way, but we know that it won't be 100% adhered to. The other caveat to this is the corresponding zoning bylaw, because if the OCP is amended, and even if the policies are adhered to, there still is, without the zoning bylaw being amended, the capacity for zones that allow for subdivision outside of the growth containment boundary to wreak havoc with the growth containment boundaries. So it definitely, the zoning bylaw needs corresponding attention.
Thank you.
Okay, I turn to Director Morrison and then Smith.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And this isn't really part of my question, but just a note to staff that the area FAPC would certainly like to look at a Highway 18 corridor proposal within the area portion of Highway 18. My question is, it's more for us and for staff around capacity and the ability to process and provide, succinct comment and input to this process. We've got budget happening, and I'll admit this is the first time in 13 years I haven't been able to digest all the material in advance of a meeting, and I'm concerned about how many hours in a day we actually have to sit down with a hard copy of this, go through it, and think logically about the impact that this will have in our community. So I know that we've already set a schedule for the engagement with the community, but I'm also thinking that I'm going to have my head down in this document and sitting in front of this Hollywood Squares for an awful lot of time in the next little while if we aren't able to get in person. But what about the time? What about the processing of this information? Because you've got 9 of us sitting here that will all have specific to their area, and I know you're talking about going into the local area plans, but I would Ms. Breen said that we should be looking at all of our individual areas as it pertains to this document. I think we should all be looking at the whole document as it pertains to all of us, because this is a document for all of the regions. So just what happens if we're not, and I'm not trying to speculate, but this is a daunting task that we have ahead of us, considering that we're engaged in budget right now too. Thoughts on that?
Ms. Breen?
Thank you, through the chair. We certainly have had some internal discussions regarding potentially we could delay the timing of the community circles. We haven't officially launched. They know they're coming. They're interested in them. And given the mammoth amount of information, and it is a mammoth amount of information, we can certainly arrange additional sessions, special EAS sessions, to go through these more in depth collectively, so the directors are feeling more comfortable with the information before they go to community consultation. We can easily move the community circles into the later spring. We haven't gone and advertised yet. It hasn't gone out. We're preparing. It's important that folks are comfortable with the information. So that's something, given the conversation today, and that's part of the purpose that we're having it today, is to get your feedback on timing, and we'll have a discussion after this meeting, and that is something that we can do, because we're hearing loud and clear that more information is and more details required. Thank you.
Director Smith?
Thank you. I really appreciate all the documents. I found them overwhelming, and definitely I ate a whole box of Halloween candy and I still didn't finish all the documents. So can somebody please deliver another box of Halloween candies for me to get through the rest of these documents? Because holy cow, and it's usually my husband that eats all of them before the Halloween, and we have to buy more. So I am guilty this year. But I did find that I made notes, and then all of a sudden I just found myself way out of depth. My notes didn't correlate with anything anymore, and I really appreciate the printed documents. Will definitely keep me moving along at a much better pace. So what I'm hearing, and I just want to make sure that I'm hearing everything correctly, is that as each director should provide comments back to Coralie on all the documents. If we feel that we would benefit from possibly a meeting with Coralie and maybe Patrick to go over some of our own area jurisdictional type items, that's possible, I'm hoping. And then I also was wondering about the training for the community circles for directors. I had asked about that earlier, and that's definitely something, but as Director Morrison has pointed out, we do have budget, and we are fairly, due to some staffing capacity, our budgets deliberations have been moved to be heavier in January for us also. So I think that when we're looking at trying to fit everything in and making sure that we're on top of all of it, was definitely something we really need to look at as our capacity also, as we do all our other director items that come to us, not just from CVRD, but from our residents that have always interesting items that they'd like us to address, and I always appreciate them. So it sounds like we're moving ahead, but I do think we also need some more workshop like this to go through the sections as we move through as a group.
I had a question for, thank you, Director Smith. I had a question for, in the chat about picking up a hard copy. Is it possible via staff to pick up a hard copy at Ingram Street, or how would we go about this?
Through the chair, I'm going to defer to the general manager.
Okay. Go ahead, Ms. Gerolf.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair. I believe that, yeah, we could simply have the copies available here at Ingram, available for pickup for directors. And if you could give us a couple days,
Sure. Okay.
give us some time to actually prepare the documents.
Sure. Director Acton, do you have a question for Ms. Gerolf?
Okay, I just have a comment or a question. Couldn't we just mail them out? Be a lot easier than driving for an hour, half an hour in, half an hour back kind of thing.
Yeah, we could work with individual directors on how they'd like to collect them. We prefer not to mail them. If you're going to be in town, it's much easier and it's a lot less expensive. If you could, pick them up, certainly we could mail them if you need that as well.
Okay. Director Kuhn, did I miss anybody? I think I said Director, you're okay? Okay, I'd like to thank our presenters, Edward, Patrick, Mark, and Aaron. Thank you very much. Very complicated and very exciting at the same time. I've been looking forward to this for a long time. And it's going to be a little while longer as well, it's very challenging, but it's worth it. Thank you so much. And we'll move on to our question period. And we welcome...
Thank you, Madam Chair. We did have one applicant who has since dropped out of the lobby. I've just sent them another invitation if you want to give them a minute, but okay. They're not in the lobby and aren't responding to the email.
All right. Okay, well, it's 4:22. Some people have to get ready for a public hearing and drive to CVRD from, so we will go ahead and motion to adjourn. We didn't get a response from that. We'll have a motion to adjourn. It's been moved and seconded. All in favor? Opposed, if any? Motion is carried. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.